I'm here today with Daniel Tutt, the podcaster behind Emancipations. He's a Nietzsche scholar. He's a philosopher. He's tearing it up. He's everywhere. He's been invited to hundreds of conferences. People can't wait to hear what he has to say about the left and philosophy and Nietzsche and all manner of things. And I've invited him on today so we can discuss. I guess the differences that have arisen between Sublation and one of our authors and our former editor of Sublation magazine. So between Chris Catrone and Spencer Leonard and Daniel Tutt. But I think, maybe in the future you should actually do a podcast with Chris Catrone or with Spencer Leonard or both. I'm just going to, instead of trying to represent their views, I'm just going to try to represent my own. And you're lucky because I'm not a scholar. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy from a state school, and I've written some novels, and that's all I've got backing me. And I'm kind of new to Losurdo. But I've been reading him today, and I thought we could discuss your anti-imperialist term, to put it in the terms of well, I think it's fair to say you've embraced anti-imperialism, but also there's a particular platypus affiliated society take on anti-imperialism. And your turn away from what's called Western Marxism. Is that a fair way to begin, would you say? Or you can correct me if that's not even the right framing for conversation.
First of all, it's good to be here, Doug. My second time. Last time you gave the title to the Nietzsche video, the opposite of the intended meaning, but I thought that was maybe like your sort of avant-garde, surrealist, sublation, Hegelian unity of opposites strategy. Maybe you'll do the same. Maybe you'll do the same this time.
Yeah. Probably my ADHD kicking in or confusion.
Yeah. Well, we should clarify terms. I mean, okay. One of the philosophers who's of immense intellectual heft and importance to the Platypus Affiliated Society, of course, is Moishe Postone. And you may or may not be aware that Postone has a criticism of anti-imperialism. Like since the early Iraq War, he wrote this really well-read, or widely read article about how anti-imperialism on the left is a form of fetishism, right? And that it mistakes a proper location of capital and the capital-wage relation as a global source of antagonism, and instead it personifies, I'm summarizing his argument, because it's an interesting argument. We should maybe it's a helpful way to throw that onto the table to understand. What I think is important, Doug, is to understand the multiple forms that anti-imperialism takes, because there are retrograde or crude or vulgar anti-imperialisms. Mm-hmm. So anti-imperialisms with an S, it's not just one thing. But I think are like Postone, it sort of is, right? And Ray Brassier, the I guess he's a Scottish philosopher, has a wonderful criticism of Postone and his position on anti-imperialism in a presentation on my podcast that you mentioned, Emancipations, as it pertains to Palestine, to Gaza, to Hamas, because I think there has arisen a type of misunderstanding on the Marxist left, because this is a debate internal to Marxists, about how we understand the historical emergence of imperialism, whether we are indeed in an imperialist stage, which I would insist that indeed we are in an imperialist stage. Mm-hmm. And an imperialist stage would be defined as one in which we have multipolarity. You probably hear this phrase. I don't like this concept of multipolarity, where there's not a single hegemon, right? But it's kind of this sort of horizontal, heterogeneous field of warring nation states, right? And there's no center to it. That's a new concept. But keep in mind, one of the confusions within Marxism about imperialism, of course, is the Empire series by Hart and Negri. Because you know what they did in that series was they said that imperialism is largely over as Lenin theorized imperialism. Okay. And so I think that has actually done a certain damage. I would highly recommend John Bellamy Foster's new, wonderful and very long. I mean, it took me 3 hours to read it. There's so many excellent citations and references in his new article on the, I think it's something like the ignorance of imperialism on today's Marxist left. And he really puts a big onus on Hart and Negri in their conception of empire. But also, frankly, I mean, philosophically, they really embrace like Foucault and Deleuze over Marx. So it's like this weird paradox of like the most popular 21st century Marxists kind of abandoning so many core tenets of Marx. Yeah. And I think that imperialism, I'm giving you a background. I think that imperialism still remains, why it remains extremely useful is because as a stage, as Lenin theorized it as a stage, what it means is the kind of a logic of historical repetition of capitalist social system in which it moves away from welfare state. And that imperialism, therefore, is not merely like foreign relations. Imperialism is also an internal domestic composition of the capitalist system that also importantly, and this I think is very important apropos Lukács in his work, imperialism refers to the disintegration of the working class. In times of imperialism, Marx and Engels theorize a disintegration of the coherence, the organization, and the struggle of the working class, precisely because the bourgeoisie becomes militarized and the class struggle becomes exported in a certain way. I mean, there's a lot of study about how imperialism really started from the first time that the working class took power in the Paris Commune of 1871, right? So there's a relation and a linkage, right, between the domestic class struggle and the international class struggle. And I think that Marx and Engels are always deeply attentive to that interrelationality, and we must be as well. That doesn't mean that we need to adopt the anti-imperialism of fools or some kind of vulgar anti-imperialism or some kind of internet communism and champion reactionary movements in the global South. That's not what that means. It means it's a more comprehensive view about the totality, an analysis of the totality of the capitalist system in its historical moment. We are in an imperialist age. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, first of all, just to respond to one figure book that you raised, Hart and Negri's Empire. I have read that book. It came out when I was an adult, and I then read it I think I read it about a decade later. I talked, Derek Varn and I critiqued it together years ago, like a long time ago. And I'll just say that I was not impressed by the book. I didn't agree with it. It seemed to me to be a way to embrace neoliberalism. And overall, in the wake of the 2008 crisis, I felt that history had discredited their thesis. So, like, we can throw Hart and Negri to the side because I'm not going to defend anything that they've written.
And I know that Platypus doesn't support them either. So, I mean, it was just a point that there's a lot of criticisms on within contemporary Marxism. David Harvey also largely abandons imperialism, right? Like a lot of these, like who's left of the French Marxists from Althusser's school have largely even abandoned Lenin, so I'm hearing from different comrades. So there's a lot of, I think we live in a time where Marxism is undergoing a pretty profound ideological fragmentation internal to itself.
Well, I think that is true, but I think that is happening broadly on the left. I think that what we're really experiencing right now probably is a decline in Marxism. That it had its moment after 2008, and then all the way through the Bernie Sanders social democratic moment, there was still a strain of Marxism. But I think we may be looking at a really, really rough period for Marxist thought. Not in terms of like our own thought or what we can work out together or, figure out, but more in terms of it finding a purchase politically anywhere. And so I think this is a moment of defeat. I think actually the defeat really probably occurred at least in 2020, and not just after the election of Trump, but the election of Trump is a very profound defeat for the left. I say that as someone who's said that it's a better of the options. I still think it's a very profound defeat for the left. But putting all that aside, for just to start with the Moishe Postone, I have read the Postone. I've read it more than once. It's History and Helplessness.
Yeah.
It did influence my thinking about anti-imperialism. I want to point out that Moishe Postone is not someone who is pro-imperialist, or that, or even, it's unclear to me to the degree to which Postone would have abandoned Lenin's understanding of imperialism. But I think you could embrace Postone's argument in this essay without abandoning Lenin. Because my understanding of having read Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is that imperialism is about the proletarian, expanding the proletariat, the concentration of capital and the expansion of the proletariat internationally, and the formation of monopolies, and the defeat at the same time. And you're right to say it represents a disintegration of the proletariat as a political force, and the defeat of socialism. That's where it ends up eventually. But I mean, when Lenin wrote this in 1916, I don't think it was at all clear that the imperialist moment, this highest stage of capitalism, would be a moment of defeat. But rather, it was an opportunity. I think it being a highest stage represented an opportunity for
correct
revolutionaries.
Yeah, he said monopoly capitalism is the antechamber of socialism, right? So he's, as Lenin does, is trying to think it as a stage of the kind of like in music, like a crescendo of the development of the capitalist system, which a revolutionary movement can take advantage of, right? So it's actually an opportunity.
And I always took that as the reason it was an opportunity was the same reason, and that this is rather flat-footed, but it's the same reason that capitalism itself is an opportunity. Even industrial capitalism itself is an opportunity for the self-emancipation and overcoming of class society by the working class, because the capitalism and its tendency to monopolize production brings workers together into, big factories and forces them to cooperate and strips them of their provincial ways and creates new relations between working class people and puts them in the driver's seat of what is becoming a global system of production. So that is an opportunity for socialism, because it creates the proletariat class, and then it places them in a position of authority and association. So that's why I thought imperialism would represent an opportunity for socialist development.
I can respond to that. I mean, I think one of the interesting points in the early Marx and Engels is the notion that in a certain way, why do we have to break from Feuerbach? like if you were going to go back, in a sense, Marxism has this emphasis on understanding capitalism as a system, right? And I know that a lot of water's passed under the bridge in the sense that now everybody is a systems thinker. But Marxism is kind of the OG systems thinker, right? That's the idea. And I think that imperialism presents Marxism with its with that impetus. Insofar as imperialism, if it's thought in a dialectic of classes, right, as if classes move history, what that means is that you have a kind of expansion and contraction of an original class conflict at a localized area that then goes global. And so that's actually one of the reasons why I push back on people that are opposed to anti-imperialism, or who think that struggles far off from the core region, using world systems theory, ultimately either fetishize capital, as Postone says, or depoliticize the working class in the core regions, which seems to be maybe perhaps a summary of some of the arguments against anti-imperialism that I hear from Platypus. Or other arguments I hear would be that, okay, the liberal NGO apparatus will utilize anti-imperialist struggle to kind of nominalize the class conflict, if that makes sense. In other words, they will bring their own liberal, progressive ideas of identity politics, and that then will supervene domestic class struggle. And my position on all of that, Doug, would be to say that Marxists, ever since the early Marx onward, up through Lenin, up through now, are thinkers of the totality. This idea of sort of, you see, because what I feel happens here is a kind of apoliticism, or a kind of retreat politics, or a kind of doubling down on the depoliticization that imperialism foments, because that's sort of the objective from the position of the bourgeoisie, is that it's kind of like two things, right? It's like either we give workers the chance to go fight, which is, there's so much has been written about this. I mean, you mentioned when you introduced me Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a thinker, according to Lukács, of the pre-imperialist era. So according to Lukács, Nietzsche, the locus of Nietzsche is imperialist thought. And one of the big focuses that he has is the idea of the problem of the suffering of the industrial proletariat. In his eyes, one of the solutions he proffers is that they go off and fight in distant lands for glory. And I feel that today the situation is quite different, right? But still, nonetheless, this idea of a kind of refusal, it's also a refusal to see class conflict in these struggles. Let's say in Palestine, Israel, in other domains, which we can talk about and bring onto the table and so on. So it's also like a recipe for a certain quietism. And I would prefer to see Marxists getting in the arena, getting in the ring with liberal conceptions of anti-imperialism and taking them on. What's the Marxist view on imperialism, right? That's what I would prefer to see.
Okay, so I want to address just one thing first when it comes to this idea that anti-imperialism is a fetishistic. That's from Postone. It's like, it's worthwhile to understand why he's saying that. He's not just saying that as a slur, right? There's a reason he makes that claim. I have the text here. Let's see. It says, okay, so he says, in neither case were there many attempts to problematize this dilemma. So he's talking about the Iraq War and the Bush administration. The dilemma that Saddam Hussein was a reactionary leader and force in the world. So there weren't many attempts to problematize the dilemma of trying to oppose the invasion of Iraq and yet not support Saddam Hussein, I think is what he's saying. Or try to analyze this configuration with an eye toward the possibility of formulating what has become exceedingly difficult in the world today, a critique with an emancipatory intent. This would have required developing a form of internationalism that broke with the dualism of a Cold War framework that all too frequently legitimized as anti-imperialist states whose structures and policies are no more emancipatory than those of many authoritarian and repressive regimes supported by the American government. Instead of breaking with such dualisms, however, many who opposed American policies have had recourse to precisely such inadequate and anachronistic anti-imperialist conceptual frameworks and political stances. At the heart of this neo-anti-imperialism is a fetishistic understanding of global development, that is, a concretistic understanding of abstract historical processes in political and agentative terms. In other words, there are good guys and bad guys, I think is what he's saying. The abstract and dynamic domination of capital has become fetishized on the global level as that of the United States, or in some variants as that of the United States and Israel. It goes without saying that this disastrous imperial and imperious character of the Bush administration has helped mightily in this conflation. Okay, so what Postone was saying is that there's been a tendency to conflate capitalist relations, or I wouldn't call it the system of capitalism, but the social relations that perpetuate capital with the United States, as if those relations don't obtain elsewhere. And so, in order to address how we should be anti-imperialist, we have to ask ourselves what the horizon of our politics is. And if the horizon of our politics is simply to balance out the capitalist class so that we have capitalists and break up the monopolies, say, so that we have different regions of the world which are dominated by different capitalist states. That's one horizon. And then the other horizon, this emancipatory horizon of Marx and Engels and socialists and Lenin, but all stripes of socialists, anarchists and so on, would be to the aim to overcome the social relationship that perpetuates capital. And so I do believe that's what Moishe Postone is pointing at when he critiques a certain kind of anti-imperialism. And yet, the question of how a responsible socialist party in the core countries should respond to the violence and aggression and the moral monstrosities that are produced by the capitalists in our own nation and the state is an open one. So, like, on the one hand, I would say we want to hold on to an emancipatory vision and not simply end up siding with Saddam Hussein as against George W. Bush. But at the same time, I myself took to the streets to protest the invasion of Iraq and wanted to oppose that war. And I was motivated to do so not as an advocate for Saddam Hussein, but as someone who was attempting to mitigate the disaster of imperialism. However, what I'll say now is, looking back on it, my activism around the invasion of Iraq utterly failed, as did the rest of the activism around that invasion. And there were a number of reasons why it failed. One of them might have been this anti-imperialism of Moishe Postone that he's talking about. But I think there were others. Like, we had a sense of a need to do something immediately. We were narrowly focused in our views of the causes of the invasion, and most of all, we simply didn't think through what would fully be necessary to have the political power to have an impact. We were ultimately shepherded into the Democratic Party. In fact, we started there and we ended there. So it was a symbolic protest organized by the Not in Our Name coalition.
Right. Answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And even though my particular group was not directly affiliated with Answer, it took on the same approach. And so, from my perspective, the anti-imperialism that was so pervasive in that moment didn't lead anywhere. It didn't help us. And if we instead had decided to try to build a socialist politics in the United States that wouldn't necessarily, in that when we started, be able to stop the invasion of Iraq, but which would build up as a power of working class politics, we may have been able by now to have had enough influence to shift the course of history a bit. You know, we wouldn't be in this position where the only option seems to be to put forward another version of the Answer Coalition and oppose Gaza on the same symbolic basis, and oppose the genocide in Gaza on the same basis.
Yeah, I mean, you had mentioned a few things regarding Postone I want to go back to very quickly. You know, one of his arguments in the essay, which I recently read in preparation for this conversation with you, Doug, is the idea that the left was sort of blindly latching on to reactionary forces without any, not only socialist, but any liberal kind of, let's say, tell us, right? In other words, he thinks that the anti-imperialism of the left was kind of nihilistic, right? It was like kind of like, you could think about it like a child getting revenge on a mean parent, right? The mean parent being the U.S. bad guy, and that and you can see that when applied in some scenarios, how condescending and frankly false that ends up becoming. I mean, we should definitely discuss in this case the situation of Hamas, for example, I mean, especially in light of what's happening in Syria with the rebels, because we see the contrast between Hamas and the rebels and how different they are organizationally, ideologically, and this idea that class struggles for national determination must somehow reflect a full purity or a full kind of transitive alignment with our own values or something like this. A, we're not in the position to advocate like that. And B, historically, the founders of our tradition, Marx and Engels, didn't even see national liberation struggles that way themselves. They didn't. They saw national liberation struggles, for example, in Ireland, as highly impure, right? As driven partially by noble principles. This is, I think, what one way to understand a dialectical assessment of a national struggle. There are some elements within that struggle ideologically which will have regressive, religious, patriarchal theology, for example, let's say, for example, right? This is sort of a truism that will exist in any national liberation struggle, but that doesn't negate the importance of the completion of that struggle in all of its impurity. And that is why I felt that I used this term I mentioned a moment ago of apolitical. That the outcome of Coutron's criticism of Hamas as bourgeois is ultimately kind of like an apolitical message that he's sending on the one hand. On the other hand, it's an implicit message that I think is against Marxism, because Marxism, Marx will say, the early Marx will say, one of the things that defines us is that we do not impose our principles on others. So if we waited for the perfect moment, for the perfect anti-colonial struggle to adopt the perfect ideology, we'd wait for eternity. It would be like waiting for Godot, the play. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. So this is what I mean. Like, I think that Marx and Engels instruct us in ages of imperialism, you have to take a wager. I'll give you another example. Marx and Engels saw John Brown's raid before the Civil War, and they said, wow, that is really great. What needs to happen is the slaves need to get armed, and they need to rise up, and they need to lead their emancipation. Pretty soon, as you know, that didn't happen. Even though some Union generals wanted to arm the slaves, it didn't happen until much later in the game, right? And Marx and Engels saw the war move into an intra-bourgeois war, effectively. They wanted a proletarian war, right? They wanted a rising of the oppressed, right? But did Marx and Engels abandon the Union cause because it didn't go the way they wanted? Not at all. They never abandoned it. Right? Marx has this phrase in his home before he died from Lafargue, where he would always say that we never shy from taking a side in class struggles of the bourgeoisie, right? We never shy away from that. So this goes back to this notion of like Marxism as an engaged praxis. Now, I think with Chris, part of the reason that he is a contrarian has to be understood by going back to his wider criticism of the left as such. Now, that's not to say that, like, the left says red, I say green. It's like he's sometimes Chris Cutrone is a bit like that, where it's like whatever they say, I'm going to do the opposite, which is, I think, part of the difficulty of dealing with him. And I think, frankly, Doug, given that I know a bit about his new movement that you guys are doing, the more positive project of civil society building.
Yeah.
Platypus itself is an engine of negation. Negation is good, right? Negation produces thought. It produces creativity, right? It gets us thinking. But at times, in some instances, negation can be insufficient. And I think in this case, it's a bit insufficient if we talk about Israel-Palestine.
Okay.
That's my view. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
Okay. Let me respond to some of that. First of all, I don't want to defend or take on the views of Cutrone because although I talk to him all the time and I think I understand most of what he has to say, I don't want to face being corrected. And so I will just say one thing in defense of Cutrone, which is that I don't believe that his problem with Hamas was that they were bourgeois. I think that it went beyond that, because I think that he would say the workers are bourgeois, or that you organize the workers on the basis of bourgeois rights, and that the bourgeois revolutions were emancipatory for their time, and that they turned against themselves. A contradiction emerged through industrialization, but that we should not just dismiss the bourgeois revolutions or even liberal forms of politics. So I just want to say he did not say about Hamas.
That's fair. That's fair, Doug. But let me just say one quick thing in response to that.
Yeah.
The ideals of self-determination are very, very liberal. I mean, I'm not talking about some ultra-orthodox, like Lukácsian standard of proletarian consciousness building. No,
I was not trying to give a full-throated
is a bourgeois thing. I think we agree on that.
Yeah, I was not trying to give a full-throated defense of Cutrone's critique of the pro-Palestinian movement. I was simply saying one thing I don't think is accurate is to say that he accused Hamas of being bourgeois. But so a little more deeply, not just that pedantic point. I would say that from my perspective, the difficulty here is not whether or not you support national liberation movements in the abstract or in other historical contexts, nor even whether or not you support the national liberation movement of the Palestinians. Okay, but rather what the American left should understand first is that their politics are mediated through the really existing politics of capitalist America. That their protests on college campuses and in the streets through various institutions are mediated by the interests that already run this society. They are not, as far as I know, in mass numbers, organizing young people to go to Gaza and fight in defense of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that they do that. I wouldn't necessarily, out of hand, say they shouldn't. But what I would say is that, to begin with, the protest movements that we saw after October 7th were protest movements. They were the kinds of symbolic politics that has dominated the left since probably at least the 60s, certainly in my lifetime. And as such, they were largely symbolic and largely about taking a stance morally, and that people think, like the opposition to the invasion of Iraq, it was about your own character rather than intervening in the world. So the "not in my name" approach dominated the protest movement in the United States. There's that. And then I have one other thing to say, which is that when we talk about the national liberation movement of Ireland or even slave revolts, we should understand that those are different than what's happening in Palestine. From my understanding, this is how they're different. The slaves, as slaves, played a role in the global economic order, a productive role. The workers in Ireland certainly also did. The slave revolt, when accomplished, transformed the basis of society. Obviously much for the better, not just because the people who were slaves were free, but also even for the free workers in America. It was an incredible improvement in conditions. In Palestine, the conditions are worse than they were for the slaves because they are pushed outside of the global productive order. They are kept alive, my understanding is mostly through donations, through NGOs and charitable international organizations. That something like 90% of the calories consumed in Palestine comes from international aid. That figure is probably not quite right. But so these are non-people in terms of the what counts in a global capitalist society. And there are many, many non-people in the world. It's not just the Palestinians by any means. So when we think about how we should help the struggle for Palestinians, my first impulse is to say there should be a joining up with the dissident Israeli movements that were already existed, that were trying to get rid of Netanyahu on a basic kind of liberal bourgeois political basis, that wanted to stop the authoritarian and totalitarian overreach of the Netanyahu regime, and around the West Bank occupations, and there should be a demand for integration of the Palestinians into the world economy. The demand for a loosening of the restrictions for work in Gaza. And it was a utopian thing to suggest because certainly Netanyahu's government was never going to just have that be the response to October 7th. Yeah. But it would have been, but it was a direction that we needed to go because as Palestinians were incorporated back into the global capitalist system as workers of some kind or another, even as miserable workers on, subsistence wages, they would still have a role and would be organized by it politically in a way that they are not now. So that would be my response to that.
That's very instructive, Doug. Thank you for that. I was recently in Lebanon. I want to take a movement out a little bit more, if I could.
Yeah.
And I hung out with members of the Communist Party of Lebanon, and their platform is very thought out. What I understand is that the structure of the working class in Lebanon, and I think some of this is true in Palestine, but even more pronounced in Gaza, is what we call a rentier society. So the vast majority of people are highly precarious, outside of wage labor, lumpenized heavily, and they rely on Western Union transfers from the diaspora to come in. So from the classical Marxist point of view of their relation to the mode of production, you are correct. However, you have to ask yourself, do Marx and Engels only think revolutionary agency? This goes to Losurdo, right? Do and this question of slave rebellions. Do we only think a revolution in the capitalist mode of production from those agents? For any criticisms you may have of the Black Panthers, I think one of the interesting things that they thought, right, was that there is actually a political potential within the lumpen proletariat. I'm a big reader of Clyde Barrow, one of the great thinkers of the status of the lumpen proletariat in our time. And I have the sense that the last thing I want to do is somehow fetishize lumpen subjects. And I'm using that term only in its classical sense of how their agency relates to productive labor. Okay? Because there's a lot of danger that comes with that. I mean, Marx and Engels would call the lumpens not social subjects, but political subjects, which meant that they were open for bribery. And that's why ideologically, the lumpens had all kinds of wayward ideology. And they ultimately were the first class that was fooled by the return of Bonaparte, right? Louis Bonaparte. And Marx talks about this in the 18th de Brumaire. So ideologically, a class position like that is very prone, right, to reactionary co-optation. And I think that that's something we need to keep in mind. But back to the Communist Party in Lebanon, right? They said, look, the centrifugal strategy is anti-imperialism because the kind of massive symptom of the occupation of Palestine, overcoming that, transcending that, right, having the freedom that the Palestinians demand would have such profound reverberations, not only economistic reverberations, but within the whole delicate balance of power of the various nation states in the region and beyond, that to advocate for it, I mean, it would also have changes in political economy as well, but to advocate for it would constitute a rupture that would upset a balance of power, right? Pax Americana, intricate imperial relations between nation states that we haven't even mentioned that are involved here, from Russia to Iran and so on. Palestine sits at the center of that, right? And the oppression of the Palestinians, I want to say one thing about this. This is why Marxists need to get in the arena here, because I think you're right. What you basically articulated is that leftists need to understand that if they advocate as a protest under the paternalism of the Democratic Party, it would kind of be the same as advocating for climate change with like Starbucks as your leader, or it's like a kind of like it individualizes the struggle and it therefore moralizes the struggle, because that's what liberalism does. And I think you're right about that. I think we agree on that. But man, if you're not in the arena advocating for a Marxist view of anti-imperialism, then you've ceded that ground to liberals. You've ceded that ground to them. Why would you want to do that? That is why, Doug, I talk to people like Gabriel Rockhill. Doesn't mean that I agree with everything that Gabriel Rockhill says. I think that Gabriel Rockhill has a lot of interesting ideas. I like Marxists that are in this arena and challenging liberalism, because we want to be careful, Doug, of what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. I feel like so many Marxists are victim of the narcissism of small differences. Gabriel Rockhill is trying to recenter the working class, but often in these strong polemics against him, right? Somehow that gets like lost in the fray. So I'm of the mind, Doug, that these days, I don't know how much more sectarianism we need. I don't know how much more we need, really. I would rather find like a series of olive branches amongst Marxists. I think Lenin said something similar to this as well. How important the unity of Marxists is, right? And so anyways, like, you know, I think all of these things need to be thought together. And so...
Yeah. I would just say that...
Go ahead.
I would just say that while I have been very critical of the pro-Palestinian movement as I've seen it in the United States, I don't consider that criticism to be me ceding anti-imperialism altogether or the struggle altogether. I feel like it's a contribution to it. And the other thing that I would say is that I agree that we don't need sectarianism, but I don't agree that we don't need debate and disagreement. One of the things that I hope for going forward with Sublation is that we can be a pluralistic journal where these kinds of debates can be worked out without it getting nasty or getting personal, so that we can fully understand as much of the reality of the situation as possible. I don't think that we're in a position where any one sect has the correct answer, and I don't think that we should start from that premise. This is one of the reasons why I like the campaign for a socialist party so much, is that by focusing on building civil society institutions in the United States and maybe around the world, and I think that's actually going on in Germany as well right now, is that that by focusing there, we can have a practical activity, we can reorient ourselves to working class needs, while leaving the intellectual, ideological disputes on the page. Like they should not inform how we operate together practically and politically as we organize. That there shouldn't be a meeting of an independent labor club where someone says, we will not accept anyone here who is not pro-Israel or is not pro-Palestine or who thinks the war in Ukraine is unjust or who wants to see the Ukrainians use long-range missiles. Those kinds of questions should absolutely be debated in the realm of ideas and kind of in a liberal way as we try to build up a base for working class power in the United States.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, I saw Chris Catrone's debate with this anonymous internet personality, Benedict Cryptofash, about the meaning of the left, where Cryptofash said the left is like as it appears, basically. Like it's not an idea, it's not a concept. And Catrone's position was, no, actually the left is a concept that has to be negated and then re-realized, like rediscovered, like in some negative dialectics, Adorno and all of that. Mm-hmm. And my position was, the left is neither of those things. Like the left itself is already inertly present in an impure and flawed sense, but internal to, like, I think the task of communists and Marxists today is not this strong negation operation of a total, and this is also why in a related way, I struggle with the platypus framework of thinking systems of thought on the left vis-a-vis categories of generation. In the sense that I understand the logic and especially in American context, of how capitalist crisis uniquely affects generations, right? Like I get the idea of the millennial left is like what distinguishes the millennial left is our unique experience of capitalist crisis, right? And the opportunity for socialism that has given out. But at the same time, if we don't start introducing categories of thinking subjectivity vis-a-vis class over generation, generational categories, I worry that we're not going to actually do the ideological work necessary. And I also think that the left, in its current structure and system, needs to be engaged differently than this pure. Because what happens when you engage the left in that pure antagonistic way? You know what happens, Doug? Various forms of censorship and reaction. And that's another thing I wanted to mention to you, which is that my experience on the left, since I've become like a writer, writing articles and publishing books, is I have been astonished at the prevalence of forms of censorship And I'm like, for example, there's this book that was canceled by Punctum with Ben Burchett and Conrad Hamilton. And they've invited me to write the preface to it. And I was just like, you know what? I'm struggling with this. I'm struggling with the appearance of censorship right and left. It's happening all over the place. And I know you're concerned with that too. And I have a lot of solidarity with you. I don't mean to jump to too many things, but I'm just saying that it's related. Because when you take on the left in this highly antagonistic, highly adversarial way, I think actually one of the negative effects is you create climates in which, we know already about, since we're talking about platypus here, we know already what happened in 2014 with the letter that Verso Books put out against platypus, which I think has been, in hindsight, a very unfortunate thing. I don't know if you know about this or if you're aware of it.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm aware of it. I was aware of it at the time. What I want to say is that while I am a good friend to Chris Catrone and I admire the Platypus Project, I'm not a member of Platypus, and Sublation project is not merely a negative. It's not. I shouldn't say merely. It's not a negative one entirely. Like what we're trying to do at Sublation, when I say we should be a pluralistic journal for debate, I don't mean we're going to highlight the symptoms and in order to force a reckoning. But rather, I hope that, people will debate ideas and even change each other's minds from time to time. And some new consensus will come out of what we can run at Sublation Magazine and on the channel and through our books and through a kind of journalistic Substack, which I keep talking about, but need to press go on. And so, no, what I'm talking about as Sublation lines with the campaign for a socialist party. Again, to clarify, the campaign for a socialist party is not a socialist party. The campaign for a socialist party is the rebuilding of working class institutions and socialists going out into the world and being of some use, and finding, and also it's a research project. Like, what is actually happening amongst the working class? Why were Haitians sent to Springfield, Ohio? What is the potential for class solidarity there? Those are the kinds of things that we should look into in the United States as socialists. And so Platypus. I admire it. It is not what Sublation's all about, because I think that we need to be both negative and positive. We need to dare to put forward our ideas.
Constructive. Yeah. I'm with you. And I know that you care a lot about censorship. And I was kind of, I have like a whiplash, or I was caught off guard dealing with forms of censorship that surprised me. And now I'm trying to theorize what is up with this turn to censorship, and sort of that's actually, I'm kind of incorporating psychoanalysis, Lacan has a bunch to say about Marxism in his time and censorship. I just wrote a paper on this. So, it interests me. And I just think that strategically, maybe there's a way to sort of compartmentalize strategies, right, of intellectual engagement in such a way where we don't rile up the worst part of the other, of our interlocutors, of the left, right? Because ultimately, one of my messages, and I think I mentioned this to you the first time I was on your show, and I've gotten a lot of flack for this, is, my engagement with the left that believes in family abolition. I myself wrote a book about the family where I was highly critical of family abolition, but that didn't stop me from doing this olive branch engagement with them. And I would say, Doug, that I have benefited immensely from those exchanges, some of which you could qualify as debates, but a lot of them are also maybe comradely disagreements. Like I presented at a major psychoanalytic association with them. And I was definitely the Marxist Lash guy, you know? And what I tried to do, and I think I was successful, was I sort of tried to show them that Lasch is a thinker that's worth engaging, and he's not some like red-brown fascist, you know? Because if you sort of treat, like this is my problem with Chris calling me a Stalinist, right? It's like, or even calling Lukács a Stalinist. It's that kind of move that bothers me. It's opposed to like some basic kind of ethics of ground rules of engagement, because it's imposing a system. I mean, in the case of the Stalinist accusation, it's just extremely antiquated and highly irrelevant, especially because I've been trying to prove that where the platypus guys think they see Stalinism, like their theory of Stalinism is sort of mystical. Like, I don't really buy it. Now, I know that I'm saying a lot against them and things like that, and maybe at some point in the future I will have a chance to actually debate them.
Yeah, you should talk to Chris Catrone. Can I just say what my understanding of Stalinism is that there was an attempt at a revolution, that it was a great moment in 1917. It was launched upon the idea that after Russia, there would be a revolution in Germany and then throughout Europe. And as the German Revolution and the rest of the revolution energy was defeated, there was a choice to be made as to what to do as communists or socialists in one country. And even from the very beginning, the aim in Russia had been to develop a proletariat class, to develop into a capitalist or bourgeois society out of the old feudal aristocracy, is how I put it roughly. And so there was an attempt to hold on, and it was not nefarious. It was a product of defeat. Stalin emerged out of that, and I believe the Soviet Union was a state capitalist formation. I think state capitalism, Chris has convinced me finally that state capitalism will be a phase in revolutionary struggle. So it's not like I would condemn that entirely, but I think that the Stalinist result was the product of a defeat, and that's how we should understand Stalinism. And today, when someone's called a Stalinist, especially in this context, a neo-Stalinist or something like that, it's because they have accepted the horizon that defeat produced, and see the aim of socialism to be the development of a better state, a better system of nation states, even, rather than the creation of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the overcoming of class society, which I think is pushed aside. So when he says someone's a Stalinist, he means they've given up the ghost. And I think that there's to a large degree, that is happening. And I think especially with younger people like the Zoomer neo-Stalinists, they just don't have a conception of socialism that beyond kind of welfare state, or statified relations. I think that is the horizon of their thought. Someone like Caleb Maupin has that as the horizon of his thought. And he'll say directly, and I admire this about him, that he thinks Stalin was a better thinker, a better theorist of socialism than Marx. Marx was a neurotic. Stalin had gumption, that kind of thing. So, and like,
admire that, yeah.
I admire that in him because it's so honest, and it's like, okay, well, now I know where I stand. No, we're not playing around. You're a Stalinist, and this is why, and critiquing it I can do, but it's, ultimately, I just know, okay, this is not. I would be glad for Caleb Maupin to help with the campaign, but I'm not going to expect a lot of movement in his thinking anytime soon.
I mean, I think a couple of things. One, I think, maybe we could link this back to the Western Marxism text by Losurdo, because one of the things that I have changed my mind about as a socialist in America in recent years is the careful forms of solidarity that I think a future socialist party should take with nations that are socialistic, that have undergone socialist revolutions themselves. There is a certain tendency on behalf of Western Marxism to see, say, Cuba or China as kind of like I would characterize it almost as like an ahistorical reading of those contexts and those state experiences with socialism, whereby the argument, and I even see this in my mentor Alain Badiou in his diagnosis of contemporary China after Deng, which is basically to say that it's pure authoritarian capitalism. There's no scent of communism in there at all, in some sense, right? And I think I've come to see that as an undialectical way of thinking it. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to go Caleb Maupin or Haz al-Din when looking at this situation in some kind of positivistic, non-dialectical way, which what I see the problem with Stalinism, just to build off of what you said, is that Stalinism enters into the picture to sort of halt the process that was unfinished of the proletarian revolution, right? It was an unfinished process that was halted and redirected in a reactionary way, right? And that's the main problem. And I think that the notion of neo-Stalinism is real today. We can diagnose the online version of it, but I would say even in Gabriel Rockhill's version, or say Losurdo's version, you've got to be careful because you got to read their work. It's not a direct celebration of Stalin as the, like you could almost think about it like Maoists would almost like fetishize Mao at times as possessing a higher form of wisdom even than Lenin. And you see this almost like, well, he built off of Lenin, so Mao is the thinker of our conjuncture, or something like that. And I think a lot of Maoists think that. That's not the claim of Losurdo apropos Stalin. If anything, Losurdo, and I know less about Rockhill, but let's just say Losurdo because he's published more, he's written more. Losurdo rarely, I mean, other than his book on Stalin, which I've actually done a whole program on with Doug Green, I do have problems with his book on Stalin, so I don't embrace all of it. He has some unethical aspects regarding how he treats the show trials, for example. Although that book has many interesting things, and especially on the question of anti-colonialism and Stalin's role in that, which may surprise you if you read it. But what I'm trying to say is that on the whole, Losurdo is a thinker who's trying to reignite, this goes back to narcissism of small differences, he's trying to reignite communism in a robust way for the 21st century. He's not trying to reignite Stalinism. Really, he's not. He's really not. He's trying to provide a type of counter-history to understand the dialectic from 1848 to the present and the way the class struggle has unfurled, how it has manifested to this moment. So he's a thinker who helps us think our present, which is like, after all, the great Hegelian task, yeah? So Losurdo is an essential thinker of our moment, okay? To reduce him to sort of like a bland Stalinism is an injustice because he's produced so much more than that. He's produced a wonderful book on Gramsci, a wonderful book on Bonapartism, a wonderful book on Nietzsche, a wonderful book on Kant, on Hegel, on liberalism itself, and on Western Marxism. There's only one book on Stalin, okay? It's his most controversial, okay? But you have to understand that also from the position of what is he dealing with? He's dealing with the total obliteration of really existing socialism, which was a trauma. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to say, I have not read Losurdo much. I mean, I read some of his book, Western Marxism, today. And what I did was I read the introduction, and then I flipped through the different sections, and I found the section on Horkheimer and went there. And I was reading that section, and I found a number of things to be skeptical about in that section. It seemed to me, I'll just give you an example, that when Losurdo was describing Horkheimer and Adorno, that he was not intellectually honest. in his approach to quoting them and or representing their views. As an example, he lifts the words free, equal, and independent from Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason at one point in a kind of mocking way. Let's see if I can find the Losurdo quote. He in that, what he's arguing is that Horkheimer's embrace of liberalism amounts to Eurocentrism and an embrace of the West and an abandonment of the struggle of the East for freedom from slavery and from colonialism. That's what he's claiming, and so the way he does it is by piecemealing quotes together. Sometimes
he mostly works with Horkheimer's authoritarian state text, which is we did a study group on the Western Marxism text, and I went back and I read portions of the authoritarian state by Horkheimer, and I will be honest, Doug, I found that to be a very problematic text. And I can
in the section of the book I read, he was not mostly working from the authoritarian state. He quoted from Critical Models, Interventions and Catchwords, Negative Dialectics, Critical Theory, Yesterday and Today, The Eclipse of Reason, the Dialectics of Enlightenment, and in just one example here would be how he characterized Horkheimer's approach to Locke in the Critique of Reason, the Eclipse of Reason. Let's see if I can find it. So he writes, once the French Revolution and the October Revolution have been disposed of, which, by the way, is completely a misreading right there, all that remained was to genuflect before a liberalism mythically transfigured and identified with the slogan and the defense of the autonomy of the individual. And that is a quote from The Society in Transition, which is a text that I could not find in English.
I will say this. I think that...
Hold on, let me get to the end of the thought.
Go ahead.
So then he goes on and says, it's a transfiguration that also affected Locke, whom Horkheimer read as a champion of the principle that all people are free, equal, and independent. And again, as if by magic, slavery and the defense of black slavery disappeared from the work of a philosopher who benefited materially from it, being a stockholder in the Royal African Company, which managed the traffic in human beings. Now, that's kind of this probably might be something to do with the translation. It's unclear which philosopher benefited from the Royal African Company. It's Locke. Okay, that's who he's talking about there. But the point here is that when you actually go to the text, which is the Eclipse of Reason, what you find is that his analysis of Locke is not celebratory, but is kind of eminently critical. The text itself outlines the history of the notion of reason through the Enlightenment.
I've reviewed the text, and I would say this is a good example of like a polemical reading, right? So Western Marxism is taking on this with a slant, with a particular like focus.
Sure, but it's worth noting how he distorts Horkheimer here, okay? Because in fact in the text, Horkheimer begins by critiquing forms of reason which he kind of characterizes as anti-intellectual and pragmatic. Like reason is just what's obvious, and quotes from early Americans who were apologists for slavery as having this form of reason. He quotes, here's a quote from Charles O'Connor, who Horkheimer quotes quite critically. I insist that Negro slavery is not unjust. It is just, wise, and beneficent. I insist that Negro slavery is ordained by nature. So this is a form of reason that Horkheimer is rejecting here, right? He goes on and quotes another author from the South who stands on the reason based on experience alone.
Right.
And then he says that Locke did not have this form of reason. He didn't reduce reason to a mere tautology as what you already think, right? But he says that Locke's theory of knowledge is an example of that treacherous lucidity of style which unites opposites by simply blurring the nuances. He did not care to differentiate too clearly between sensual and rational. In other words, between what you immediately experience and take to be true and what you reason out. Atomistic and structural experience, nor did he indicate whether the state of nature from which he derived the natural law was inferred by logical processes or intuitively perceived. However, it seemed to be sufficiently clear that freedom by nature is not identical with freedom in fact. His political doctrine is based on rational insight and deductions rather than on empirical research. So what we have here is a critique of Locke in the context of an unfurling of the history of reason in the Enlightenment Western tradition, one where Horkheimer is directly pointing to the injustice of slavery as a product of a false kind of reason. And what Losurdo takes out, this quote, of free, equal, and independent, he's quoting Horkheimer quoting the government of the early America, which was aimed to teach that men are by nature all free, equal, and independent, which is a goal of the early American state, not something that Horkheimer or even the founding fathers believed had been achieved. Okay, so Losurdo it does a disservice to Horkheimer and to his reader by distorting Horkheimer this severely in just a single paragraph, and it goes on again and again. As I read, there plenty of quotes, just little tiny snippets stitched together by his commentary. And after reading a few of the quotations in context, I couldn't trust that Losurdo was giving anything close to an accurate account of what Horkheimer's views actually were. So I would say, from what I read, that Losurdo distorts his opposition, and that you can call that polemical or rhetorical. Sure, it is, both of those things, but it's also dishonest and unjust, and not helpful to distort the text that way, to distort your opposition. You should try to understand what your opposition actually says and critique them on the basis of their actual thought rather than on an invention that you
I think Doug, you've provided one example, which
I could have another. I could give you another, and we could go through it together, and I'm quite confident I could find many more. For instance, the other one is around this quotation that Losurdo puts forward. In the security of America, an immigrant could endure the news of Auschwitz. It would be difficult to believe that Vietnam is robbing anyone of sleep, especially since every opponent of colonial wars must know that the Viet Cong, for their part, used Chinese methods of torture. That's what Losurdo quotes. Okay, it's in the context. This is Adorno now, in the context of saying of an argument against actionism. And he says, among the arguments available to actionism, there's one that indeed is quite removed from the political strategy it boasts of, but that possesses a much greater suggestive power. It argues that one must opt for the protest movement precisely because one recognizes that it is objectively hopeless, following the model of Marx during the Paris Commune, or when the Communist Party stepped into the breach during the collapse of the anarcho-socialist Councillor government in 1919 in Munich. Just as those responses had been triggered by desperation, so too those who despair of any possibility should support pointless action. The ineluctable defeats offer solidarity in the form of moral authority, even to those who could have foreseen the catastrophe and would have bowed before the dictate of unilateral solidarity. But in truth, the appeal to heroism prolongs that dictate. Whoever has retained the sensibility for such types of appeal will not mistake its hollow tone. And then he says, in security of America, an immigrant could endure the news of Auschwitz. It would be difficult to believe that Vietnam is robbing anyone of sleep. So, and then from there, I've already quoted that. Whoever imagined that as a product of this society he is free of the bourgeois coldness harbors illusions about himself as much as about the world. Without such coldness, one could not live. So whatever you want to say about Adorno, you can disagree with him here, but Adorno is not saying, as Losurdo, suggests, that, the atrocity in Vietnam is not an atrocity because the Viet Cong did bad things, used Chinese methods of torture. He's not saying that, the victims of Auschwitz are noble victims and the victims in Vietnam are not. He is saying something altogether different about when we should give up on reason and strategy and any attempt to win and act in a way that we know in advance is hopeless. Act like the people who are going out into the streets saying not in our name, knowing full well that will not end the ethnic cleansing in Gaza or the invasion of Iraq. That's what Adorno was talking about here. And for Losurdo to mischaracterize that leads people to embrace actionism as if it has hope in it, against their own, I think it probably pretty immediate understanding that it is not. No one can go out in the street and say, not in our name, and think it will actually have an impact unless they're of the political class in such a way that they think that what they deign to reject will stop the military-industrial complex.
Okay. With respect,
yeah.
No, okay, with respect, I'll search down the Locke quote in Eclipse of Reason. I once wrote a review of Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason, speaking for myself as like a philosopher scholar. It's actually a book that I like. You know what it's really about? It's a criticism of American philosophy. And one of the interesting side points to Eclipse of Reason, I don't know if you're aware of this, is the American philosophical academic community absolutely despised the book because it took on the legacy of James and Dewey and American pragmatism and argued basically that, it's a thorough criticism of American philosophy such that American philosophy does not contain the capacity for speculative thought, for abstract reason, because, like Dewey famously considered himself a Hegelian. And so Horkheimer is bringing like a different version of Hegel into, and this text coincides with the Frankfurt School not successfully finding a university to house them. So they actually had to go back to Germany, and then they came back vis-a-vis Hollywood or LA. But they were I've read the Eclipse of Reason as well, and I haven't critiqued it in writing, but I was aware that it was a critique of positivism and critique and Thomistic thought and pragmatism.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting book in its own right. Look, one of the ways to understand the multitude of references in Western Marxism as a text is that Losurdo is often trying to pinpoint the absence of solidarity with an anti-colonial struggle. So How We Remember the Past, which I think is the name of the Adorno essay you were just reading from, was written 1 year after the My Lai massacre. And Adorno puts a lot of attention on the fact that that's not mentioned, as well as a general view that Adorno has to the Viet Cong that really, and actually I criticized Losurdo myself, but he assumes, that Adorno adopts a Nietzschean lens of ressentiment, so that clouds Adorno's view about any optimism regarding the Vietnamese socialist project as a national project that would seize the means of production and productively develop an independence. because ultimately Adorno sees that horizon as kind of falling back in line with the bureaucratic capitalism. He doesn't see it as like the East as an emancipatory bloc or socialist nationalist independence. So that's obvious. Mm-hmm. It's implicit. And I think Losurdo is criticizing it from that point of view, because what he's trying to say is that Marxists have done a disservice to anti-colonial struggles by refusing to see their movements as movements of liberation. They foreclose that element. They deny that element. And I think Adorno's doing that here.
Well, in that particular section he's talking about, this is from a book called Critical Models, Interventions, and Catchwords. And so that's the book's title, right? And then the essay is, let's see, Notes on Human Science and Culture, I think. No, let me find out. It's okay.
Something about history, how we see the past, something like that.
Yeah, I think you might be right. Let's double check. Prologue to Television is the title of this section. And so we could go back and see just the full context. I gave some of the context of what Adorno was saying, but
I don't think it's really useful. I don't really. I mean, I think we can examine.
But I don't think it's. I know that Adorno was critical of the German left and of the new left, and that Marcuse and Adorno had a kind of a small falling out over that, and he called the police on student protesters that came and disrupted his class. And but I don't believe that I do think that in that comment about Chinese methods of torture, there is an indictment of the Viet Cong there. That's unavoidable.
Right.
Okay, so that I believe is true.
Yeah.
But it's put there in the context of when it's necessary to act without hope, when it is necessary to stand up in defense of emancipation and the human, even when you know you're going to fail, when you should sacrifice yourself and your own thinking. Now, it's not just like throw yourself on your sword, but actually distort your own thinking and misdirect yourself in order to stand up for what is human, rather than hold on to the bourgeois coldness in order to be able to think another day, let alone fight another day, right?
Yeah.
So the point here was not that Adorno simply completely dismissed any liberatory potential within the Vietnamese struggle, but rather that it did not live up to or did not reach the threshold which would compel us to act in a hopeless way against our own reason. That's what Adorno is speaking to. Now, you may think that he's wrong about the effect of the protest movement in the United States, that it actually had an effect that went beyond what he would see it capable of doing. You may think a variety of things about what Adorno got wrong, but to condemn, and I think if you critique him on that level, if you say, look, no, if the Frankfurt School had been more supportive of the new left, there would have been more solidarity with the Vietnamese. Look, I suppose you could make that claim. But the other thing to point out is Adorno was not leading the left at that time. The new left at that time was much more in the camp of Losurdo, was much more the same as the protest movements we see today and that I was a part of in the early 2000s. The new left was the actionist, anti-imperialist left that Moïse Postone came out of and tried to criticize. Moïse Postone, Adorno, all of these figures are marginal figures, critics of the left from the left. They're not directing history at all. They're trying to offer critiques as they get rolled over by it. So look, okay, go ahead.
Okay.
I know I'm getting all passionate, but when it comes to like
No, that's fine.
my guy Horkheimer and Adorno, I'll step up.
Look, my understanding of Horkheimer on the question of imperialism is that actually he actually sort of deserves quite a lot of critique, and I'd be curious what you think about the authoritarian state section in Western Marxism, because that is a text which I found to be abandoning so many like core Marxist foundational principles of conceiving of state power, but also making kind of like this fait accompli with liberalism, that I think it's valid for a critique to be waged there. In my thorough lecture series I did on my Emancipations channel on Western Marxism, you'll notice I do not accept all of Losurdo's kind of flyby polemical moves. I'll give you an example. He criticizes Ernst Bloch in, I think, his text, The Principle of Hope, for, and this is something, Doug, that is a true debate in my head and in my thinking as of late, for having solidarity with the optimism of the American Revolution. And Losurdo, as he does, points to the existence of pro-slavery attitudes amongst the founding fathers and the kind of compromised and bourgeois nature of the revolution. I think he probably refers to it as a counter-revolution similar to Gerald Horne. So what I'm trying to say is that I'm a reader who is an independent thinker myself, and I'm not, that this is a thing, Doug. A lot of young people think, and maybe you see this too, that like Marxism is about these master intellectuals and you just sort of find one and you just ape everything they say. And I'm like,
yeah,
no. I mean,
no.
I'm 40 now, so maybe it took me until I turned 40 to realize that that's not what Marxism is.
Right.
In other words, I don't even want to see any thinker like that as some kind of non-castrated, perfect, exemplar or something like that. No. So I read against the grain on everything, and I encourage everybody to do the same. And a lot of his polemics, on the other hand, hit very well. I think his critique of Agamben on the Iraq War is excellent. I thought his critique of Hart and Negri is excellent. I thought his critique of Foucault is excellent. I thought his critique of Hannah Arendt was fabulous, because, my God, Hannah Arendt kind of really destroys Marxist categories, big time. I mean, everybody knows that, but he really shows the damage that she performs. And the hypocrisy of so-called left academics supporting Hannah Arendt. Anyways, so there's a lot of merit to this text, okay? And it's not it's not like a disingenuous thing. I'll search down that footnote.
Well, another problem I have with this text, the Western Marxism, is the category of Western Marxism that he's using that would include Arndt, whatever.
Arendt, yeah.
Arendt, with Horkheimer and Adorno, or with Althusser, or, these people are not Foucault. What? Why is Foucault in here at all? He was not a Marxist. He was not a Western Marxist. Negri and Hart, or Hart and Negri, they're also particularly kind of anti-Marxist revisionists. Well, I would not put them in the same category with Adorno and Horkheimer, and I think it causes confusion to do so. I think this category of Western Marxism is far too broad. It's just anyone from the West fits in there.
No.
Who's on the left?
I'll tell you why. It's a kind of the reason that these sort of Marxist adjacent or even anti-Marxist thinkers like Foucault and Arendt are included in the canon. It's not that they themselves are included. It's an acknowledgement that Western Marxist thinkers have adopted their methodologies and their categories of thought. That's the notion. In the case of Hart and Negri, Foucault over Marx in the Empire series, it's clear as day. Exploitation is basically thrown out, right? The whole conception of micropower is adopted in the Foucauldian sense, for example. Mm-hmm. So at the same time, you have to recognize that Foucault does have a real foothold in Marxism, given that at a certain moment, for a few years, Foucault flirts with Marxism. he flirts with Maoism and says that he's trying to really make an intervention into Marxism, right? So a lot of scholars, I mean, just go to, take UC Berkeley, Doug. Are you aware that in the anthropology department at UC Berkeley, you are not really allowed to do a dissertation that is utilizing Marx without the supplement? Like, you have to, Marx is treated after Foucault in some departments at Berkeley, according to some of my inside contacts, as a reactionary thinker, right? As Foucault thought, as a thinker of the 19th century. So Foucault's had huge impacts on the ecosystem of Marxist intellectuals. That's a fact. I don't think that's deniable.
But I just think I don't disagree that in the university system, a lot of damage has been done to the Marxist tradition, but why replicate it? I mean, when you throw in Foucault alongside Adorno, you are allowing that distortion to continue. That the fact that you need to supplement Marx with Foucault because Marx is a reactionary is basically that's ideological warfare being fought on the level of in the university seminars.
Well, that's actually where Western Marxism has a certain origin, though. Like, Western Marxism, like it or not, is a university discourse. Like, that's part of its founding blemish, right? And I'm of the mind that Marxism needs to use the university almost like a fugitive would. We can't deny the university, but we can't be succumb or totally ensconced in it, which is why I felt like, in my studies of like communism in the 20th century in France, most of the most interesting publishing was actually happening by the French Communist Party. So like,
yeah, sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
it's not surprising at all.
The university is the end all be all of Marxist thought. But Western Marxism has had that fate. It has been largely the way that it's gone.
Well, I would just say that, okay, certainly someone like Zizek probably does belong in a book on, like, I would title it, what the university system has done to Marx or something like that. But I was saying that I also want to say I admire Zizek as a philosopher, but I don't think he's a good representative of Marxism. And I've talked to him about it, actually. But I would just say that while it in practical terms, you're right that in reality, in really existing Western Marxism, it's an academic category. If there were to be Western Marxism based in the working class, if we can think the non-identity of Western Marxism, these figures like Foucault would not be a part of it. And that doesn't mean people should not read Foucault if they want to and find something interesting there. It's just that it's not contributing to the Marxist struggle for socialism. It's in fact standing in opposition to it. So read it the way you would read Hayek. Don't read it the way you would read a Marxist. That's what I would say. And there's good reason to read Hayek. But
that's kind of the impetus of my Nietzsche book, right? Which is left Nietzscheans have kind of sold us a raw deal where they said, well, Nietzsche's totally compatible. We can make a synthesis with him and like a easy job. And my point is more different than that, which is actually Nietzsche's more productively read as an antagonist to our objectives. And you get a lot out of him when you read him that way. Things appear differently when you have an innocent reading or an apolitical reading or aesthetic reading of him. Same goes with Foucault, perhaps.
Yeah, and I'm not I don't care to really enter into the debate around Nietzsche. I've read some Nietzsche. I read Genealogy of Morals, and I found it very interesting, but I thought, well, that's a one-sided reading. I'm going to now read Hegel instead, and I'm sure that there are many things that I'm missing from my education about Nietzsche, but to me, that's people. I feel like, yeah, kids are going to read Nietzsche. And kids are going to do what you said earlier, which is they're going to find the guy they like or the woman they like, and they're going to think this is a person that has all the answers. I did it when I was in my 20s. Oh, yeah. I would, for me, it was Guy Debord. It was, that was it, and that was every thought I had to be pro situ, and then that was wrong. So everything I had was very difficult because I couldn't even be pro situationist. But the point here is like I was a fanboy for that. But eventually, over time, I realized, I had misread Debord because I hadn't read enough, and that there were problems in Debord that I needed to understand without like deciding that he had nothing to contribute, but just that this was not that all of this work, intellectual work, is not about finding the right answer and giving it to the people right now. It's a collective process of trying to think through history and think through our situation. And that doesn't mean you could just be eclectic and not notice a difference between Foucault and Marx, or that see when there's oppositions that are actually like political and adversarial, on a level that is not just the loyal opposition, but actual opposition. You should know that Heidegger and, say, Horkheimer are not in alignment and that they disagree with each other, I watched last night with my 20-year-old son. Now, I can't believe he just turned 20. Still living at home. We watched The Examined Life.
The guy that I met in Portland.
Yeah, he came. My son who came with me to your reading.
Yeah.
Have you seen The Examined Life?
I love The Examined Life. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. But I was kind of shocked how many times Heidegger's name came up.
Oh yeah.
From these supposed leftist philosophers. It was.
That was the 90s, though, right? That was.
No, it was 2008.
Was it? Oh, was that late? Okay. No, but I guess what I'm trying to say is the thrust of the depoliticizing thrust of existentialist and continental. Remember, they used to use this word continental philosophy. Continental philosophy as an academic discourse was itself highly depoliticized, decontextualized, ahistorical, I would say. Like that's why I love a Marxist reading of Heidegger from Lukács, where one of the first things he'll say, well, actually, one of the first things that one of the best disciples of Lukács will say about Heidegger, Lucien Goldmann, is that being in time should be read as an implicit response to Lukács' history and class consciousness. In other words, what if a Marxist reading of Heidegger began with that premise, right? We actually read Heidegger as himself. Of course, he's never read Capital. He's even said it's not for me. He's interested in the threat of proletarian revolution. He's interested in the same thing that we are, but from a different point of view. He's trying to obscure it from a different point of view. That to me is a really great. That's actually one of the things we were going to talk about Lukács, but Lukács becomes interesting for me because he becomes a guide for a lens, for a Marxist lens, on which I can then read the history of philosophy differently. That's why I've been so big on the destruction of reason. Like Lukács gives us this perspective on philosophy that you don't get from the bourgeois academy. And there's a lot of merit in that. I feel that's very useful to kind of truly situate a thinker in their time and to see how they relate to the class struggle, right? To me, that's what it's all about. Every philosophy should be read like that.
Yeah, I agree. Listen, you should come back and we should do that Lukács episode sometime. I'd like to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Maybe I can give you like a reading and we can read it, together. You can come back. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to do that. And, you can like Losurdo all you want and still be part of the campaign for a socialist party. That doesn't matter. But I will always just reserve my right to be critical. And I think that we should be able to be critical of each other's ideologies. after all, most of this is just petite bourgeois bullshit, and until we get something going, So, but I very much enjoyed talking to you today, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks a lot, Doug.